The rope had worn her skin to a raw, weeping red at the wrists. It was a detail she focused on, a small anchor of pain in a sea of humiliation. The sun beat down on the dusty main street of Redemption, a town that had long since forgotten the meaning of its own name. It baked the ground hard and bleached the life from everything, including the faces in the crowd that had gathered to watch. She was tied to the hitching post in front of the saloon, a piece of unclaimed property left to scorch. Her dress, once a pale blue, was now the color of the dirt, frayed at the hem and clinging to her like wet paper. She kept her head bowed, her hair a curtain of tangled brown hiding her face. She learned long ago that looking at them only fed the fire. They murmured and pointed. Some laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that caught in the hot air. A few spat in the dust near her bare feet. She was a farmer's debt, a promise broken when the rains failed for the third season and her father's heart gave out right alongside his crop. The man who held the note, a rancher named Fletcher with eyes like chips of slate and a mouth that was always curled in a sneer, had brought her here. He'd declared her forfeit, like a lame horse or a broken plow, and now he was making a show of it. He sat on the saloon porch, drinking whiskey, enjoying the spectacle of her slow erasure. The crowd began to thin as the novelty wore off. The sun climbed higher, relentless. Thirst was a stone in her throat. Her world had shrunk to the burning circle of sun on the back of her neck, the bite of the rope, the drone of a fat fly buzzing near her ear. She did not cry. Tears were a currency she no longer had to spend. Then, a shadow fell over her. It was a different kind of shadow, not the passing bulk of a curious townsman, but something still and deliberate. She did not look up. She heard the soft scuff of worn boots on the hard-packed earth, a sound that was somehow quieter than the silence around it. He just stood there, a few feet away, blocking the worst of the sun. She could feel his gaze, not hot and judging like the others, but cool and steady, like well water. From the corner of her vision, she saw a worn duster, the color of twilight. Hands that were cracked and calloused hung loose at his sides. He carried the stillness of the open plains within him, the quiet patience of a man who watches the sky for rain and understands waiting. He said nothing for a long time, simply stood as a bulwark against the sun and the lingering stares. Fletcher's voice cut through the haze from the saloon porch. "Something you want, Elias? Get a good look. It's what happens when you deal with a man of my standing and come up short." The man, Elias, did not turn. His voice, when it came, was low and rasped, like stones grinding together under a river. "She's had enough sun." A laugh, sharp and mocking. "She'll have as much sun as I say." The papers signed. "She's mine to do with as I please." Elias finally shifted, a slow turn of his head. His eyes, from what she could see under the brim of his hat, seemed to hold whole winters in them. "What's the debt?" "More than you got, widower." Fletcher shot back, taking a swig of his drink. "Her old man owed me 200. For seed and stock. All dead now. Just like him." Elias reached into a deep pocket of his duster. His movements were unhurried, economical. He pulled out a worn leather pouch that looked thin and sad. He untied the drawstring and emptied its contents into his palm. A few silver coins and a collection of smaller denominations glinted dully. It was not a fortune. It was not even a fraction of a fortune. He walked over to the porch, his steps measured. He stopped at the bottom step, looking up at Fletcher. He did not offer the money. He just held it in his open palm. "This settles the interest," Elias said, his voice flat. "The rest I'll work off. On your south fence line." Fletcher stared, incredulous, then roared with laughter. "Work it off? You? You can barely keep that hardscrabble patch of yours from blowing away. What makes you think I'd want your labor?" Elias's gaze didn't waver. "Because my word is good, and because it gets her out of your sight. You've had your fun." Something in his tone, a quiet finality, seemed to cut through Fletcher's bluster. The rancher's eyes narrowed. He looked from the pitiful pile of coins to Elias's unreadable face, and then to the girl at the post. He was bored of the game. This was a new one. "Fine," he spat, waving a dismissive hand. "Take the trash. But you owe me, Elias. I'll come to collect on that labor when I see fit. And I work a man hard." Elias closed his hand over the coins, walked back to Fletcher, and dropped them onto the table. They made a small, tinny sound. Without another word, he turned and walked back to her. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade caught the sun for a brief, blinding moment. She flinched, a small, involuntary jerk. He paused, his hand hovering. He knelt, not in front of her, but to the side, giving her space, respecting the cage of fear she lived in. With two swift, clean slices, the ropes fell away. The sudden freedom was a shock. Her arms, numb and heavy, dropped to her sides. The blood rushed back in a wave of pins and needles, a fresh torment. She staggered, her legs weak from standing for so long. She didn't fall. He was there, not touching her, but close enough that his presence was a steadying force. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice still low. She couldn't answer. A nod was all she could manage, a slight dip of her head. He turned and started walking, away from the saloon, away from the center of town, toward the dusty track that led out into the unforgiving landscape. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just went, assuming she would. And she did. She put one foot in front of the other, her bare soles protesting against the hot, sharp ground. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. The town of redemption receded, its sounds fading until all that was left was the whisper of the wind and the soft crunch of their footsteps. The journey was a long, silent procession. The sun beat down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He walked at a slow, steady pace, never getting too far ahead. Once, he stopped and unhooked a canteen from his belt. He held it out to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most precious thing she had ever known. She drank slowly, carefully, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough like weathered wood. She pulled her hand back as if burned. His farm was little more than a scar on the vast, empty face of the land. A small, clapboard house, its paint long since stripped away by wind and sun, stood hunched against the elements. A leaning barn, a half-mended fence, and a windmill that turned with a sad, rhythmic squeak were the only other signs of life. Off to the side, under a lone, twisted cottonwood, was a single, small mound of earth marked with a simple wooden cross. Sarah. The name was carved into the wood, the letters softened by time. Elias didn't point it out. He didn't need to. The grave explained the silence that clung to the house, the hollowness in his eyes. He carried a whole winter inside him. He led her to the house, the door groaning open on dry hinges. The inside was sparse and shadowed. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a cot in one corner. It was clean but empty, a place scrubbed of personality by grief. He gestured toward a small room off the main one. "You can stay in here." The room contained a narrow bed with a patched quilt folded neatly at its foot. There was a small window, its glass wavy and thick, that looked out onto the endless expanse of brown earth. He stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the light from the other room. "I don't lock doors," he said, and the words were a promise. Then he turned and left her alone, pulling the door almost closed but leaving a sliver of light. She stood in the center of the small room, her body aching, her mind a blank slate. She touched the quilt. It was coarse but clean. She looked at the door, the gap of light a confirmation of his words. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling beneath her. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, a single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was something else, something she didn't have a name for. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. They were two planets in a slow, careful orbit around the sun of survival. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm. He would tend to his few chickens, his gaunt horse, the stubborn patch of earth he called a garden. She would rise after him, finding a cup of black coffee left on the table, still warm. First, she did nothing. She stayed in her room, a ghost in the shell of a house. But the inertia couldn't last. The need to do something, to be something other than a burden, began to stir in her. She started small. She swept the floor of the main room, the swish of the broom a comforting sound. She washed the 2 plates, the 2 cups, the single pot he cooked their meager meals in. She did not ask. She just did. Elias never acknowledged her work with words. But when he came in from the fields, his eyes would flick to the tidy floor, the clean dishes stacked by the basin. A faint, almost imperceptible softening would touch the hard line of his mouth. It was a language they were inventing, a dialect of shared silence and small deeds. One afternoon, she found a pile of his work shirts, torn and threadbare, by the hearth. In her old life, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, her mother had taught her to sew. She found a needle and some raw thread in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, tucked behind a tin of tobacco. She sat in the rocking chair, a piece of furniture that always sat empty, and she began to stitch. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but the motions came back to her. She mended the rip in a sleeve, the tear at a collar. She was not just mending cloth. She was stitching their lives together, one small, careful stitch at a time. When he came in that evening, she had folded the mended shirts and placed them on his cot. He looked at them, then at her. He gave a single, slow nod. It was more than enough. The prairie was a harsh mother, but it offered small gifts if you knew where to look. She started to find them, tiny, resilient wildflowers pushing up through the cracked earth. She picked one, a bloom the color of a blood orange, and placed it in a cup of water on the table. Later, she saw him trace the edge of a petal with his forefinger when he thought she wasn't looking. Another day, she walked out to the lone cottonwood. She stood before the small grave, the wooden cross that read, Sarah. She didn't know who Sarah was, wife, sister, daughter, but she knew what loss looked like. It looked like this patch of earth, this quiet man. She cleared away the weeds that had grown around the base of the cross, her hands gentle. She laid a small, smooth stone she'd found on the mound. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition of his pain, which he bore as silently as she bore her own. The cooking was his chore, meals of beans and tough bread. One evening, she saw him kneading dough, his large hands clumsy. The resulting loaf was heavy, dense. When he sliced it, he looked at it with a kind of weary resignation. A little dry, he muttered, more to himself than to her. The next day, while he was out mending the fence line that seemed to be in a constant state of collapse, she found the flour sack. She remembered the feel of dough under her mother's guidance. She worked it, her hands sure and light. She let it rise by the warm hearth. The smell of baking bread, a scent from her stolen childhood, filled the small house, chasing out some of the shadows. When he came in, he stopped just inside the door, his nostrils flaring. He looked at the golden-brown loaf cooling on the table. That night, they ate her bread. It was light, soft. He ate 3 pieces without speaking. When he was done, he pushed his plate back and looked at her across the table, the firelight flickering in the depths of his eyes. "You didn't complain about mine," he said. A tiny smile touched her lips, the first she had felt in an age. "That loaf died in vain," she said, her voice thin from disuse, like a fence rail worn by the wind. His answering smile was a rare and wondrous thing, like seeing a flower bloom in the dust. This one didn't. The nights were the hardest. The darkness brought back the faces from the crowd, the heat of the sun, the rough bite of the rope. One night, a nightmare clawed its way out of her throat in a strangled cry. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was silent. She thought she was alone in her terror. But then she heard it, the soft creak of the rocking chair in the main room. She pushed her door open a crack. Elias was sitting there, fully dressed, a rifle resting across his lap. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the cold fireplace, a sentinel on duty. He had been there all along, guarding her sleep. She slipped back into her room, the fear receding, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of safety. The next morning, she gathered her courage. As he drank his coffee, staring out the window at the gray dawn, she spoke. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He didn't turn. "Why what? Why did you take me?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of his own thoughts. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice sounding like it came from under floorboards. "She was a kind woman, too kind for this place. A fever took her. Quick. Before she went, she made me promise. 'Don't let your heart turn to stone, Elias,' she said. 'Don't you do it.'" He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were vast with old sorrow. "I was breaking that promise. Seeing you at that post. It was a reminder. A man's got to be more than just what he's lost." She understood. He hadn't saved her. They were saving each other. Winter came on fast, a white wolf howling down from the mountains. It buried the farm in snow and locked them inside. The small house became their entire world. The wind turned mean, rattling the window panes, but inside, the fire in the hearth burned bright and steady. The rhythm of their life deepened, became more intimate. They sat by the fire in the long evenings, she mending, he carving small animals from scraps of wood. He was surprisingly skilled. He carved a small, graceful bird and left it on her windowsill. The sanctuary they had built, however, was a fragile thing. The world outside had not forgotten them. The harbinger came on a day when the snow had briefly ceased, leaving the world pristine and silent. It was a rider, a black speck moving against the vast white canvas. He did not approach the house but rode along the ridge overlooking the property, a dark omen. Elias saw him first. He stiffened, his hand going still on the piece of wood he was carving. He rose and went to the window, his body a rigid line of tension. She came to stand beside him. The rider was one of Fletcher's men. He watched them for a long time before turning his horse and disappearing back over the ridge. "He'll be back," Elias said, his voice flat. "Fletcher will come. He thinks the snow has made me weak." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She thought of the rope, the sun, the laughing faces. "What will we do?" Elias looked at her, his gaze steady. "This is my land. This is my home." He didn't say our, but it hung in the air between them. He will not take anything else from it. 2 days later they came. Fletcher and 3 of his men, their horses black against the snow. They rode right up to the house, their arrogance undiminished by the cold. Fletcher dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow crust. He smirked, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Elias," he called out, his voice sharp, "the holiday's over. I've come for my property." The door opened. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He held no weapon. He simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet defiance. "She's not property, Fletcher. And she's not leaving." "I have the paper," Fletcher sneered, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It's all legal. She belongs to me until your debt is paid. And your labor in this snow is worth nothing. I'm calling it in." He gestured to one of his men. "Go get her." Elias didn't move, but his whole body seemed to draw taut. "You'll not set foot on this porch." Fletcher laughed. "Are you going to stop the 4 of us, old man?" It was then that the door opened again. She stepped out, closing it softly behind her. She did not look at Fletcher. She did not look at his men. She carried the heavy old hunting rifle that had belonged to Elias's father. It was clean, the wood oiled, the barrel a dull, deadly gray. She held it with a familiarity that was startling. Her father, the failed farmer, had taught her one thing of value before his spirit broke: how to shoot. He taught her to shoot rabbits for the pot, coyotes for the chickens. He'd taught her that a steady hand and a clear eye were a kind of power. Fletcher's eyes widened in amusement. "Look at this. The little mouse thinks she's a mountain lion." He turned his mocking gaze back to Elias. "You'd hide behind a woman. She ignored him. Her eyes scanned the stark white landscape. She saw it. A single, dead branch sticking out of a snowdrift about 100 yards away. On its very tip, a small, dark pine cone clung stubbornly. It was no bigger than her thumb. Without a word, she raised the rifle. It settled into her shoulder as if it were an extension of her own arm. She did not aim at Fletcher. She did not aim at his men. She breathed out, slow and steady, just as her father had taught her. The world narrowed to the bead of the front sight, the distant pine cone, the vast, cold silence. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was shockingly loud in the frozen air. It echoed off the hills and was swallowed by the snow. For a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the tiny pine cone on the distant branch disintegrated into a puff of wooden dust. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. Fletcher's smirk was gone, wiped clean from his face. His men stared, their hands frozen near their own pistols. They weren't looking at Elias anymore. They were looking at her. They saw not a victim, not a piece of property, but a woman who could have put a bullet between any one of their eyes with the same unnerving calm. She had demonstrated not only skill but restraint. The message was clearer than any threat. She hadn't missed. She had chosen her target. She lowered the rifle, her gaze finally meeting Fletcher's. Her eyes were not filled with fear or hate. They were just clear, level. Fletcher swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He looked at the woman holding the rifle, at the implacable man standing beside her, at the empty, unforgiving land around them. He saw two people who had nothing left to lose and had therefore become unbreakable. He had come for property, but there was no property here, only a home. Without another word, he turned, climbed onto his horse, and rode away. His men followed, casting nervous glances back at the woman on the porch. They disappeared over the ridge, their dark shapes consumed by the white. The air on the porch was still and cold. Elias looked at her, his face a mixture of awe and something else, something softer. His hand came up and rested on her shoulder, his thumb brushing against the collar of her coat. It was the first time he had touched her with such open affection. "You didn't run," he said, his voice thick. "There was nowhere left to run to," she replied, her voice steady. He stood there for a long moment, his hand warm on her shoulder. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a survivor, but as a person whole and complete. "Lena," he said. The name was quiet, a question and a statement all at once. It wasn't her birth name. Her birth name was buried with her father, tied to the post in redemption. This name was new. It was hers. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Lena," she repeated, "felt right." They went back inside, into the warmth of the fire. The rifle was leaned against the wall, no longer a weapon, but a symbol. A line had been drawn and defended. That evening, as the fire crackled and danced, he brought out the small, worn pouch he kept his most precious things in. From it, he took a thin, simple silver ring. "It was Sarah's," he said, holding it out to her. "It's not much." She looked at the ring, then at his face, at the hope and fear warring in his eyes. She took it. It was a perfect fit. The snow melted. Spring came, and with it a change. The story of the standoff had trickled back to town. One day, a neighbor from the next farm over, a man who had previously only offered Elias curt nods, rode up with a sack of potatoes and 2 laying hens. He didn't say much, just, "For the winter you lost," before tipping his hat to Lena and riding off. It was an apology, an acceptance. They burned the tattered, dirt-colored dress she had arrived in. They watched it turn to black ash and smoke in the fire pit, the last remnant of her old life vanishing into the sky. Together, they planted a new garden, this time with seeds the neighbor had given them. They planted it near Sarah's grave, not to cover the memory, but to tend to it, to let new life grow alongside the old sorrow. The house began to change. Lena hung simple curtains she'd made from flour sacks over the windows. The small wooden bird Elias had carved for her sat on the mantelpiece. The house, which had once felt haunted by absence, now breathed. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the low murmur of conversation, the comfortable weight of shared silence. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of blood orange and bruised purple. The air was cool and clean. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, callous skin against callous skin. They didn't need words. They had built a life out of things far stronger. He was no longer just a widower, and she was no longer just a debt. They were Elias and Lena. They were home. The land itself, which had once seemed so intent on breaking them, now held them in a quiet embrace, promising nothing but the steady turning of the seasons and the simple, profound grace of another day together. This story, it ain't just about a rescue in some dusty, forgotten town. It's about the fact that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see. It's about how two broken people the world had thrown away, can find the missing pieces of themselves in each other. It's a story that proves that strength isn't about shouting loud or swinging a fist. True strength is a steady hand on a rifle you hope you never have to fire. It's a quiet promise not to lock a door. It's the courage to plant a garden in the shadow of a grave. So here's your naming. For every soul who's ever been tied to a post, whether by rope or by regret, by debt or by despair, remember that your worth is not decided by the crowd. It is forged in the quiet moments of defiance, in the small acts of kindness you give and receive. And if you're brave enough to stand your ground, not with rage, but with a calm and certain knowledge of who you are, you might just find that the silence that follows is the most powerful sound in the world. Because a fire only changes everything if something new and stronger is waiting in the ash.